Well, we lived in Gibbons Terrace for the bulk of my life. In fact, I was born in Gibbons Terrace. I was born in on the sitting room of my granny and grandfather's house, and that was number 12. The girl I married, she lived in number 10, so didn't travel far. And my mother and father then were given number 15 in 1940. So rather a long time ago. And it was a standard terraced house, two up, two down. And, well, some of the things that were a nice change from former houses at that time was the fact that it had a toilet which was within the house. And that was it's hard to explain it to young people today, but that was a dramatic move forward. And we would have been reasonably well off. We certainly never ever saw hungry, that's for sure. But I was fortunate, I was the oldest in the family, and I was the oldest grandchild. So that was a fortunate position to be in, because you had grandparents who fawned on you to a large extent, and you had loving parents as well. But then the next thing, my wife was pregnant again. Well, of course, in those days, up till the time you were 18 or 20, you didn't even know what pregnancy was. You certainly didn't use the word anyway. When my mother was expecting my next brother, I was farmed out to a granduncle and grandaunt for 5 months. It was among the best 5 months of my year, of my whole life. Those few months, and in that time, I remember being brought to see the German fleet, which had surrendered. It was parked in the Foyle estuary, and I remember being impressed as a 6-year-old child with the links that held the submarines from moving. The chain links were 4 inches thick, and they were massive things altogether. But the second thing I would say about that day was the family bought me a £1/4 of sweets, which I devoured in no time. 4 sweets probably I'd ever had. And because it was all ration books, wartime, and that sort of stuff. One thing I couldn't understand was why the devil, the ships were all painted with the same colour. Kind of I suppose it was battleship grey or something was the colour. But they didn't look attractive compared to as boats look today. But I didn't understand things like camouflage, of course, but it was a massive thing. But then somebody asked me about the sweets, and I said, oh, they're gone. But they were for the whole family. I suppose, well, I was off some, even at 6 years of age, I was off some Christmas card lists at that stage. Didn't go down too well. That was the first time I was away. The second time I was away was another great experience. I was a little bit older, 1947. Fabulous summer after a pretty hideous winter. It was dreadful. I think it was 47 or 48. And I was living in Maguire's Bridge in Fermanagh. And a train that ran through, my granduncle was the station master there. And he was unusual in so much as he was a Catholic station master in the Great Northern Railway. And that was very unusual. They usually didn't get to that elevated position. But he was a shrewd operator. And I remember somebody asking him one day, who is the boss here in this station? And he said, well, I am for 364 days of the year. And on the other day of the year, the porter, Mr. Hare, is in charge. and that was the 12th of July. So vastly different times to today, where they're talking about things like a united Ireland and all those sort of things. But my God, it was a different time then. But I had a great 4 or 5 months in Maguire's Bridge, between swimming and fishing and all those things that young lads would love to be doing. And we had a heck of a time. I used to play with the 2 young hares right up, and I remember going to see the parade on the 12th of July, and they were going to kill me for going. Why would you want to see that? Well, I thought it was a great spectacle, and the bands were very good, particularly good. But anyway, back at base, it was what schooling you could get, and at times were very, very tough then, because the hosiery industry was going through a very difficult time, and they were all locked into the industry itself. There were no other jobs. The only other job you could get would be a builder's labourer, because most of the hosiers were not particularly well educated. The older guys, the real old guys, because the tradition was that you served your apprenticeship to your father. My father did that. He left school aged 11, was very proud of the fact that he could read and write. It was a bit limited, of course. So when he would read the evening paper out loud, which was, that was the only news source really at the time. Radios were pretty rare in the houses, and I can recall very well Mr. and Mrs. Cashel used to put the radio out on the windowsill when the All-Ireland semi-finals and finals would be on, and you would be there listening to Micheál O'Hare, and so on, making it. The game was exciting if the ball hadn't even been there. You know, he was a great commentator for excitement. He did a stint in the Grand National and was very highly spoken of in that as well, because his fluency and accuracy, and he knew every jockey, and he knew something about the background of each of them, so that he could say all the hours he spent at such and such a body stable are not wasted, as he recovered from a bad jump here and the horse is still running well. You know, he made excitement out of nothing because he had a wonderful knowledge. He was the same in the GAA. He did terrific research. Micheál O'Murray would be the same. He would have known the families of most of the players. So as a consequence, he would have had a lot of information to impart that weren't necessarily to do with the game. But I grew up in the shadow of my father, who had been a very good local athlete and had in fact won an All-Ireland title running the half mile, and he had a bronze medal for the quarter mile, and those races took place in Jones's Road, which of course is nowadays Croke Park, and it had a running track round the outside of the football field, which was exactly 1/4 mile. So 1 lap for the quarter mile, 2 laps for the half mile. And that's all, of course, changed. It's all metres now. And so you have the 400 metres and the 800 metres. But I grew up in the shadow. It was expected that I'd be a great athlete, and I certainly wasn't. I played football with the local team, played cricket with Balbriggan and Ring Commons in the Fingal League, and I was the wicket keeper, and believe me, I was wicked. But I suppose the sort of big challenges in those days was they started to put a white marking in the centre of the road. Now, it was not continuous or anything like you see today, but a splash of white paint every 10 metres or so. And the idea was that you went on your bicycle in the middle of the road, cycling to the left-hand side of one white mark and to the right-hand side of the next one, but with no hands. You had no hands on the handlebars. If I saw my children doing it, I'd marmalise them. And if I saw my grandchildren, I'd be absolutely horrified. Horrified. And the one massive difference between those days and today would be we spent all our time and energy kicking football, playing with a skipping rope on the road outside, and a game called Guinea, which was played with a piece of ash stick, and a very simple game, but a game where 10 or 15 or 20 could play in a relatively small area. If you had an area that was, say, 30 metres by 30 metres, you could easily play the game there. It was an ideal game. And no cost to set it up, which was a great benefit. The other thing we used to play was endless football matches. And who was going to buy the ball was always a problem. Where could you get one? Where could you get a ball? Well, I'm sure there were occasions when Glebe North were missing one ball, I'm sure. I don't have any evidence, of course, now, but that's gone. Shinoim Sharkatya. But I suppose there were a lot of things, a lot of aspects of it that you didn't understand. There were things that were not nice about those days, certainly. I don't want to look through rose-coloured glasses back at the good old days. Corporal punishment in schools was horrendous. You were likely to get 3 or 4 slaps on your right hand down near the fingers, and then you'd be told to sit down and write a composition, handwrite it with the same hand, and your fingers swollen and sore, and then you get slapped again because your work wasn't very neat. It was, I don't know, it was a very sad reflection on the schooling system at that time. And what made it worse was that the teachers that were dishing this stuff out became the inspectors who inspected the next generation. And it took a long time for that type of thinking to go away. I don't know. I suppose it must have been nearly 1970 when the law came in saying you can't do that anymore. Children should be treated properly. And I'm sure there was outside influence on that. I'm absolutely sure. But the one thing that I know the church were heavily involved in all of the schools, if I think that every one of them were controlled by the church. And the church didn't seem to notice this was going on. And if they did notice, they certainly didn't call stop and say, this is not good enough. But the treatment was terrible, and it was just not right. And I'm glad that day is very gone. I see in those days, if you wanted to punish a child, you sent them to school. These days, if you want to punish a child, you keep them at home from school because they just adore going to school. It's a great thing. I dreaded going to school from time to time when things wouldn't be going too well. The teacher would be giving you a rough time, or one teacher might be giving you a particularly rough time. And by the way, in those days, you had the same teacher for 2 years. So if you set out in the first month on the wrong foot, you had a rough 2 years. It didn't end easily. On the whole, if I look back, we had a very, very happy childhood. Our parents were basically good people. In later life, my father drank too much, But that wasn't unusual for hosiers. They worked in very high humidity for 8 hours with no tea break. If they wanted to take a tea break, it was at their own expense because they were on what they called piecework. And I think that's piecework in the sense of 1 piece, 2 piece, 3 piece. You got paid for what you produced. It was a very, very tough system. But I remember him teaching me to tie off. These were lady stockings he was making on a frame. He made, I think it was 24 at a time, and he taught me how to tie off the ends of these things so as he could have his cup of tea. That gave him 10 to 15 minutes of free time. It was a fascinating thing. At that time, the biggest difficulty was getting past the doorman to get into what was called the number 4 shop, which is the area he worked. The temperature was, I don't know, in Fahrenheit, it must have been very close to 90 degrees and very high humidity because it was produced by steam going into the room. And that was to do with having the machines working well, smoothly, which was what the money was there in the machines working, not idle. Smiths at that time, Smiths in Balbriggan, was a terrific, well-known name. They had a football team. They had an outing every year to maybe someplace like Llandudno in the north of Wales. Over on the ferry in the morning, you got, I don't know, an hour or two in Llandudno, and then you were back on the ferry and home that night. You didn't stay overnight, but that would have been a huge trip. And I remember my parents going to Blackpool one time, and again, that was over to Blackpool and back in one day. So you were on a boat at, I don't know, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. You went into Liverpool, you went to visit Blackpool, and home again. I never heard them speaking about any place on the east coast of England because the ferries didn't go there. It was 8 hours, if I remember correctly, for the ferry to go to Liverpool at that time. I'm 24 years retired in another couple of weeks. That was unimaginable to a hosier because retirement age didn't mean very much. Most of them died basically from the working life and conditions they worked in. They were inhuman, really, when you think of it. And as a consequence, most of them would hit ill health in their 50s. My father died age 65, but I can remember him going to Mass, walking to Mass with a walking stick. He aged 60. He was an old man. And I remember when he was about 62 or 63, he said, we wanted to take him in a cart because his sons had cars, and we wanted to take him to Mass. No, the day I can't walk to Mass, order the box. And that literally is what happened. He didn't go one Sunday, and he died on a week of the Monday. So he lasted 8 days after he couldn't walk to Mass, because that was something they all did, walk to Mass. It was only country people who used a pony and trap to go to Mass. And as a young lad, as a child, one of the great things to do was to ring the bell by they had these rings on the wall, which they could tie I suppose they were every 2 or 3 metres along the wall outside the church. And it was for tying the ponies to them while the people were in at Mass. We used to lift these up and let them fall, and they made a ringing sound. So it seems very simple in terms of nowadays, but as 4-year-olds, that was one of the things you did. The pension age in those days was notional in so much as, it might have worked out very well for people who were working in offices or something like that, but it certainly didn't work for the people in the hosiery industry. And when you consider in 1902, the working hours in the linen factory in Balbriggan were starting at 6 o'clock in the morning. You had a break at from 20 to 8 to 8 o'clock. And then you had your lunch break in the middle of the day at 1 o'clock. And a siren sounded to make sure you come back to work, because people didn't have wristwatches. Working class people didn't have wristwatches. I remember my grandfather had a nice pocket watch and a chain, but he won that as a runner in some event or other. He was a good runner, as was my father. Unfortunately, the rest of us didn't seem to have that gene, or maybe it's fortunate we didn't have that gene, because in those days you could go to what they called flapper meetings and run in these flapper meetings, and you had bookies at them. So you had this runner against that runner, and they all had minders. In many cases, the minders would be people, say, maybe a local butcher or something like that, or shopkeeper. Their job was to get you there, make sure the gamble was on if you were going to win, because you'd know the value of every opponent that was there. So it was not too much different to Cheltenham race meeting, where the bookies laid the odds. Everybody was 6-4 or something like that, and then somebody else went to 3-1 or 4-1, and they weren't going to win anyway. It was very different to the way athletics meetings run today, where it's highly organised. There's checking for drugs and everything. In those days, the drugs they took would be 2 raw eggs, if you could get them, in what was called an egg flip. That would be the thing that was supposed to be good for your wind. Well, I don't know if it was, but anyway, that's what they used to take. But the retirement age was an interesting thing. You had people, Charles Dillon, for example, was a frame operator in Smith and Company, and I think he worked for 70 or 71 years. So he has to have been a man in his 80s at that time. But that was in the days of the, let's say, specialised stockings. So you have Mangan and Charles Dillon and a few people like that who were highly skilled, but they were individual frames they worked. They didn't work in the mass-produced area, which was where the likes of my father and the other hosiers in later days worked. They worked in an area where, from about, I'd say that started probably in about 1910 or something like that time, where it became mass-produced goods. And then shortly after that, you had tights come in, and that was a completely different process. And I can remember tears in the eyes of several of the old hosiers as they were paid to smash the frames up and dump the raw material, what was left of the frame, dump it. I mean, it was very, very different times to today, I must say. Interestingly, today, there's still plenty of room for artisan products. That was all gone after the Second World War. There was no frills. There was very, very little artistic use anymore. It was now more about function, and function meant survival. You had loads of allotments around Balbriggan where families would grow vegetables and that sort of stuff too. I can remember over towards the Bower, they had a field there with, I don't know, there must have been 100 or 150 allotments in that alone. Now there were other ones as well around Balbriggan, and these were very, very common and very, very cheap. It was sort of sixpence for the year. I believe the prices now are 300 or 400 or something like that for a small allotment. It was a very different time. It was a time at the end of, ration books ran on. It must have been near 1950 or thereabouts when they were finished. And I can remember very well, butter would be delivered on a Friday afternoon. You'd be watching for this butter. Now you could have plenty of butter on your bread Friday evening and Saturday morning, or Saturday during the day, and none on your lunch during the week. Or you could spread it out. Well, of course, what happened generally in the family was one of the individuals in the family always had a knife which was bigger than their belly, and they took as much of this butter as they could and ruined the whole thing for the week. And so you went maybe 1 or 2 days with what they called fried bread. So that was fried and dripping. And the dripping came for nothing from the local butcher. You got suet and you rendered it down into dripping. And of course there were no fridges in those days, so you scraped the mould off the top of it and kept using it. It sounds crazy, but that's how you lived. They were tougher times, certainly tougher times, very different times. But I don't know if they were worse, they were just different. Going to school, the school was the opposite end of the town from where I lived. We would run the entire way, which was certainly 2 kilometres, might be more, and we would run that distance to school. We would also run home when school was finished. You would run the whole way. The only thing, if it was a wet day, you would shelter for a moment or two under Mrs. Warren's big tree at Church Street corner. And other than that, but you minded your own business going, and there was good reason for it. The population of the town was just over 2,000, and you were known by name and on sight by everybody in the town. Didn't they take guards? The Gardaí, they didn't pay too much heed to you, but people living in their houses seemed to stand a lot at their door, and they knew everybody, every kid going by. So if you broke a window, you might as well own up to it. You were going to be told on anyway, and it would be back at home base before you got home at 3 o'clock. So you had to answer the call all the time, but the population was just about 2,000. In those days, the centre of the town was the business of the town. The shops, you had Andrew's shop in Hampton Street. Later you had Martin Carey's shop there in Hampton Street. Then you had Mr. Derham's shop on the square. And I remember that with fond memories. That was my first job, pushing the delivery bike, taking the orders in the morning, making the deliveries later in the day. That was my first job. That was paid 35 shillings a week on Saturday evening at about 8 o'clock. You would be paid roughly 8 o'clock. You'd be on duty till 8:30. But you were trying to get away at 8 o'clock. Very difficult to do because you always had some old dear who came in and wanted potatoes delivered for Sunday lunch, for Sunday dinner, and they would arrive in at 10 to 8 or 5 to 8 in the evening, and they wanted them delivered that evening. So that you had to do. When you looked at the town, public houses, I don't know how many, there was over a dozen anyway in the town at that time. So bars of Snugs and all those sort of things were the order of the day. You had a few premises which sold grocery and drink. One part of the shop would be divided off from the other. You had Conley's and Ennis's did that sort of thing. You had Derham's public house, which is now a medical centre, which kind of, you have to wondering about that. You had what was the old church, then became the old school, and afterwards became an abattoir. Now, you have to wonder, how do you go from a church to killing the cattle for the population? But you had a local abattoir. You didn't have frozen meat delivered by some big truck. It was local cattle, local produce. Tom Murray and Peter Klusky's butcher shop. But the centre of the town was where everything happened. Well, if you fast forward to today, if you were to ask a child in the schools now, where is the centre of Balbriggan, they'll probably say it's Millfield, the shopping centre outside the town, which literally sucked in a very short time the entire life's blood from the centre of the town. And as a consequence, you've boarded up premises all over the place. The other big change was you had one fast food shop in the town, and that was Malacca's Chipper. Nowadays, there must be 10 or 12 fast food places in the town, if not more. It's completely changed because you did your cooking yourself. In those days, it was a rarity to go to it was mainly guys coming home with a few drinks on them who had the chips, fish and chips or whatever, but you certainly wouldn't go to Mr. Malacca's for your Sunday lunch or anything like that. Nowadays, it's delivered to you. Very different times. The population in Balbriggan now must be 25,000, and I can walk down the street in Balbriggan and I rarely, very, very rarely would ever meet anybody I know. It's extraordinary. It's a complete change of population. Well, we moved out of the town 35 years ago, roughly. We live in Knoll Parish, and I'm a runner in Knoll after 35 years. I believe it's 70 you have to live. My chances are not very good because in 15 years I'll be 100. So work that one out yourself. So that would be, I suppose, the biggest difference. The graveyard is full. I can remember when you could have room to play football in the graveyard in Balbriggan, and it's full now. There's no more vacancies. Fortunately, I have a grave there. Whether I'm buried in it or not, I don't know. I have quite an affinity for Knoll as well. That would be a good resting place. But maybe it's too early talking about that yet.